Good afternoon and welcome to this next episode of Governance Dialogues. My name is Elisa Cole and I'm the Managing Director of Governance Center, and I'll be your host today. And for those of you who are joining our program, who have been watching previous episodes, welcome back. As you know, this program is focused on governance priorities and conversations with thought leaders worldwide. And today I thought to dedicate this topic to the issue of corruption and exploring global corruption in conversation with Alejandro Salas. Alejandro, welcome to this program.
Hi, Alisa. Thank you very much for the invitation and for the chance to speak with your audience.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And let me just perhaps before we jump into the conversation and the questions, that I have many for you, and as I'm sure does our audience, perhaps give a few words of intro to the why I've chosen to zoom into corruption issues today with you, and sort of give a few words of context. Of course, we all know that corruption is globally recognized as being a persistent and quite a malignant disease, let's call it that way. And that a few years ago already, the World Economic Forum put it the cost of global corruption around 5% of global GDP. So we're not really talking about peanuts here. And then, of course, we know that particular sectors or particular types of activity like ports, for example, customs, police forces and other sectors are more prone to corruption, as are, for example, certain types of companies. And here we're often discussing state-owned enterprises and their particular risks to corruption. And what we see is, of course, and we work quite closely with different countries around the world and advising governments on measures that they can introduce to rein in corruption activities. All countries essentially around the world have a sort of an anti-corruption authority that has developed an anti-corruption plan, ideally speaking, of course, and we'll talk about that, a risk-based plan that focuses on these sectors that I just mentioned. And yet what's interesting is that if you look at the last CPI report, the Corruption's Perceptions Report, which was issued earlier this year, just about a month ago, and which I look forward to discussing with you today, the findings of that report are quite stark in a sense that we know that 2/3 of countries score below 50 on the 100 sort of point scale, and that in about half of the countries, the corruptions or perceptions of corruptions have been stagnating, so not improving at all. And of course, that's alarming. And those are some of the, it provides, I think, some interesting context for us to have this discussion. And for those of you who perhaps are less familiar with the Corruption Perception Index published by the Transparency International, I'd like to say that it's an index that ranks countries, about 180 countries, on their perception of corruption based on sort of a wide assessment of sources, about 13, I think, separate data sources that collate information and perceptions from business community, from NGOs, from civil society, and other stakeholders that have presumably important views on the subject. So Alejandro, welcome. Just one word about your background specifically. I think it's quite important to say that you've been working in this world of anti-corruption for quite some time, where you've held several senior roles in different regions at Transparency International, and of course your background in Mexico and other countries has given you a glimpse into how challenging it is to battle corruption risks. And so I've invited you today to talk to us a little bit about this latest report, and perhaps the first question I would like to ask you, perhaps to start off with a little bit of a more general question. This report links or talks quite a bit about civil society movements and institutional infrastructure, and how those two essentially define the context for corruption. And that kind of gave me the idea to ask you whether you see in your work over the last, basically 20 years or so, whether corruption is really more of a political economy than an economy, sort of political economy, as opposed to an economic phenomenon.
Yeah, well, thanks, Alisa. I'm very happy you started with that type of question, because corruption is multidimensional. No, you can argue it's a moral and ethical issue. You can argue it's about politics. You can argue it's about economy. It's about business. You can see it from various perspectives. But I would say that in essence, it's an economic issue, and it's linked to its political economy, as you correctly point out. No, because at the end of the day, an individual or a company or institution that engages in corrupt behavior is not making the decision, I want to be moral or I want to be immoral. It's actually, I want to grab an opportunity to maximize a benefit, to appropriate certain resources, to gain advantages. So it has completely to do with political economy. We stress a lot the part of civil society and institutions, but actually there are more the mechanisms to contain, to reduce, and to push back in corruption, rather than being the motivators of the problem. The problem is really about divesting public funds for the benefit of a few, about being able to influence an election to get an advantage for certain thing. I mean, when a drug cartel, for example, to go to a radical example, decides or engages in financing a political campaign, they don't do it because they want to see an ideology they believe in power. They do it because that mayor that they are financing or the governor of a certain region will allow them to use the drug trafficking routes. Or when a big company, a legitimate company, let's move from the drug cartel, when a legitimate company, like let's say Odebrecht in Brazil, remember the big scandal around Petrobras and the construction companies, when they engage in financing political campaigns in Latin American countries, they don't do it because they believe in this ideology or that ideology. They do it because they guarantee they will get contracts in return to do business. So it's political economy. I think it's very clear. That has implications, of course, in terms of creating other big damages like ethical, eroding institutions, bending rules, and so on. No, but the engine, I would agree with you, is essentially political economy behind.
Yes, and the consequences are very much economic. And speaking of economic consequences, what I would like to ask you, it's sort of more of a contextual question. I mean, obviously, the report highlights quite a bit developments related to the pandemic and what role these developments have had in essentially affecting corruption. And as far as I understood, that most of report's findings are quite negative on terms of the role of COVID in facilitating, positive for corruption, negative for the society. And I would like to ask you sort of how you see the pandemic having affected both, let's call it the grand and the petty corruption. Is there a particular sort of types of corruption that we've seen flourish in this environment? And what have been some of the government responses to that?
Yeah, no, this is terrible, because I mean, what we have observed with the pandemic, besides the health crisis, of course, and all the implications, but in terms of corruption, it's almost like a casebook study of opportunities for opportunistic corrupt behavior. Because, as you correctly point out, I mean, there's from the micro level, the simple fact that you can bribe someone to gain access to a vaccine that probably, according to the rules established, to your age group or whatever, you are not entitled to get. But if you have power, if you have influence, or if you have money to pay a bribe to access a vaccine, as simple as that, you can bribe your way into taking a vaccine that probably a 30-year-old healthy guy skipped the line and took that vaccine away from an 80-year-old person, no, that deserved it. That's at the micro level. Then you have opportunistic behavior. I mean, I have to say, like here in Germany, no, let's don't only talk about developing countries, but here in Germany, there was a big scandal because some members of parliament in former Chancellor Angela Merkel's party even benefited with some contracts in buying masks and equipment and so on. No? And so you can also see it at the bigger level of big procurement processes, taking advantage of your position of power to benefit your own pockets. And one that is probably the most dramatic is that because it's an emergency measure. I mean, remember that most countries scrambled, and well, not no one, and I'm not blaming them, were prepared for such a big thing, such dimension of the pandemic. So of course it became a state of emergency, and then that allowed many hard-handed regimes to abuse that emergency powers to actually skip transparency measures, to simplify processes, no, under the excuse that this is an urgent measure, this is a medical emergency, this is national health, national security, and so on and so forth. So they could actually go around the established protection mechanisms for the use of public resources, or even to silence the media or so on, no? Because this is a health emergency. So we use my executive power to go and do whatever, no? Which sometimes was used in a positive way, but many times not, no? So I think those are three examples at the micro, at the more procurement level, if you want, at the company level, and then also at the major political regime level, where you can actually use the opportunistic behavior to abuse your power, no?
I mean, it's interesting, the examples you gave, and also obviously that you're the TI secretariat being based in Berlin, that you use Germany as an example, because it's probably not the one that comes to mind for most observers, because it is not really seen as one of the more corrupt countries worldwide. And what was also interesting in the report, at least I found it, being Canadian, that some countries like Canada, but also Australia and Japan, sort of the premier, let's call them jurisdictions in terms of, I guess, perceptions of corruption, as far as perceptions of corruption are concerned, have actually slid quite a bit in this year's assessment, CPI assessment. And I wonder if you could sort of say a few words as to how this sort of transpired, and what, perhaps lessons learned are there to countries who, or decision makers who are looking to avert that scenario happening to their country.
Yeah, no, and I'm from Mexico, so I can be 1 hour or more here giving you examples about Mexico or other countries to that matter. So it's I actually like that we're also touching on Western democracies or developed countries, as we want to call them. But it's important because, unfortunately, no country is free of corruption. I mean, there are some that perform better than others, but it's important the comments we're making now, because I use Germany on purpose, also to highlight how these things happen here. But also you mentioned, for example, Canada, or I can also think about Austria, for example. I mean, those are two countries that usually perform okay in the highest part of the table, because they are stable democracies. They have well-functioning checks and balances systems. In general, the watchdog institutions in general work, but they are not free of corruption. And those two countries in particular, just to highlight a couple, they had their big scandals. I mean, you remember Prime Minister Sebastian Kurz in Austria. He was involved in two scandals, no? One when he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he was tweaking and using public funding to finance some surveys when he was going into his political campaign. And then there was another procurement scandal he was involved into, so that cost him his job, which at the end of the day, there is the corruption, because as I say, it's not that Austrians are cleaner than Mexicans. There's always the possibility of engaging in corruption, but there are systems that enable it more than others. So in this case, the former prime minister was able to engage in corruption, but because the system somehow worked, even if at a later time, but it was discovered, it was made public, and at the end of the day, he lost office, no? That didn't prevent the corruption from happening in the first place, which would be the ideal, but at least there was a possibility of punishment. And with Justin Trudeau in Canada, yeah, something similar. He was also engaged in some public funding going to some foundations where his family was involved. And so at least these things get discovered and somehow they are sanctioned or punished, no? But corruption exists, and the key thing would be to actually prevent it from happening. What occurs is that in these established democracies with more solid institutional frameworks, there is less incentive to engage in corruption because you have a bigger chance of getting caught while engaging in the corrupt practice. But it can still happen. No?
Yes. And we often talk about sort of the impact of enforcement when we talk about also corporate governance cases, and the fact that obviously enforcement is a big deterrent from engaging in all kinds of illicit activities. And it's interesting that you spoke about Canada and Austria and the cases that we've seen there, and how in fact these types of cases can even occur in places that we perhaps least expect. And what's interesting, I think, in the report is that, you know, obviously there are some usual suspects like Denmark, which is like 88th place, and Finland, 85th place, and Sweden also 85th place. So in terms of score, 85th score. These are countries that have traditionally, like let's say Canada or Japan, have traditionally scored quite high. Conversely, what's also, I think, not often discussed is that some European countries, like we have, for example, Romania or Hungary, have scored basically half of the points of the, let's say, higher scoring European countries. So even in the European continent, which is generally praised by TI and CPI, unlike, let's say, you know, Africa or whatnot, there is still a huge disparity, without even going to, let's say, Russia or like very, very sort of far Eastern Europe, on the Eastern European continent, eastern part of the European continent. And I wonder what you could say, what are your thoughts as to what does that tell us about the efficiency of the legal framework? Because ultimately now in the EU, I mean, at least technically speaking, most of the kind of legislations are, let's say, applicable to all member states. And yet we see this huge delta between the top performing and the lower performing. Would you care to say a few words about that?
Yeah, no, definitely no, because I mean, at the end of the day, an important thing is to have an adequate regulation. That's key. That's a starting point. No, as long as the rules of the game are clear, there's the institutions that are meant to be protecting the public resources or keeping an eye on how decisions are taken, and that allow civil society to ask for information, journalists to do their jobs, etc. That's perfect. That's a regulatory framework. That's an enabling environment. Now, one thing is the institutions and the laws, and the other one we know very well is the practice, right? So, I mean, and again, sorry to talk about Mexico, but it happens in other places, but Mexico has in many ways been always like a leader in producing state-of-the-art institution or legal frameworks, but then it's about how they get applied. It's enforcement that counts, and is, for example, at the beginning, when you make your introduction, you were talking about how countries have set up anti-corruption agencies and so on, but there's a big difference on how you set up an anti-corruption agency, right? If there are some countries that have an anti-corruption office that sits in the presidential palace. So it's actually like a couple of guys that work directly with the president, and they're meant to be keeping an eye on the president and his friends or the cabinet, and they have no teeth, they have no funding, and they are mostly doing, you know, like more like marketing, if you want. And there are other countries that actually provide autonomy to the agency, provide the adequate resources, and provide the legal provisions that will allow them to do their jobs. No, so I think that this discrepancy that you see many times within regions has a lot to do with the actual enforcement of the legal frameworks. First, they have to be good. They have to be, according to good standards, and they have to be realistic, etc. But then all these agencies and all of these systems that are meant to contain or punish corruption, if it happens, need to operate. And that's where that's the key of the issue. That's why, again, and I come back to the first question when we're talking about civil society, let's broaden civil society / journalism / business people and so on that want to do things right or that want to actually prevent corruption. They can operate better and be a counterbalance to that power of the authorities or of corrupt authorities, because not all authorities are corrupt, no? But when they want to counter corruption, they can act freely and they can operate. That's why in highly corrupt regimes, it's very important to be able, if you want to engage in corruption, to actually control the media, close access to information, silence the people that are actually raising the hand and complaining about you, etc., etc. Have control elections so your cronies keep on winning and so on. No? It's the playbook if you want to continue to have a system engaging in corruption. So that's why civil society, journalism, clean business, and other actors are, for us in Transparency International, a key element in the equation of fighting corruption. So in a country like, let's say, Sweden, which is not clean and there are corruption cases, but in general, you can speak up, you can be a whistleblower, and you have the freedom and the resources in the prosecution offices, etc. And potentially in Romania, in Bulgaria, that's still not in place, right? So that's what makes the big difference, even if you have a similar regulatory framework.
And you've in this comments, you've just sort of outlined all of the different stakeholders and the importance of these various stakeholders. And indeed, this is a fundamental part of how the CPI is conceived through these surveys of these various stakeholders. But I think you've, particularly, if I understood you correctly, zoomed into the importance of anti-corruption authorities and judiciary. And I wonder if you could say a few words about the setup of actual anti-corruption authorities, because you mentioned some of them are part of the presidential office, and obviously you recommend that they're not. Could you say a few words about sort of, let's say, the governance of the anti-corruption institutions and how they should, at least theoretically, be set up in order to, provide that effective mechanism?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that is very important, because in order to be an effective watchdog and control those in power, you need to be on the side of politics. So the fight against corruption in any country is not a government task. It's like a state task. It goes beyond who is in power. Doesn't matter if the election is won by the left, by the right, by the Greens, or whoever wants an election and is in government for a period of power. Containing corruption, keeping an eye on public resources, integrity are state functions that they need to be beyond any political cycle. So these anti-corruption authorities need to be out of the political equation. They cannot be appointed every time a government changes, or they cannot be political actors. They are technical actors. They should have selection processes that are open, that are clean, to select who's going to be in those agencies. They need to not run parallel to the electoral system in a country, and they need to have enough autonomy, meaning that they don't have to report to a minister or to the executive. They need to report to a parliament, ideally, or to a body that is representative of different political positions and not only dependent in one political party. It's a little bit like a judiciary system. It has to be an extra power that is not part of the executive, that they are meant to be keeping an eye on. That's the key for the success of an adequate agency.
And we've been advising to a number of governments on these type of issues, and in fact, reading Oftentimes it's the founding law pursuant to which the Anti-Corruption Authority is founded, that it's so important in defining its independence and its ability to engage in a real way with these issues. But if we step away for a second from the, let's say, the institutional framework, which we've covered in these last few questions, and look at, let's say, the real issues on the ground, to me, it looks like one of the, let's say, the more critical issues on the ground, and one which was highlighted by the latest CPI report, but not only, it's also an issue that was highlighted in the last reports of FATF and also the OECD, around beneficial ownership. And for those of you who don't know, beneficial ownership is basically the way ownership of companies is reported, and the accuracy with which it is reported to, that allows essentially regulators to trace and track and find also, among other things, where the money flows and to whom the benefits of ownership of these companies accrue. So beneficial ownership obviously has been an important issue all over the world for regulators and for these international organizations I mentioned, and obviously also for you. And it was mentioned, I think, on several occasions in your latest report. So I thought perhaps it would be interesting for you to highlight your views on where we stand with this, let's say, fight to get beneficial ownership right around the world, and what are the remaining issues and where.
Yeah, that is extremely important. And we're actually very glad in Transparency International and everybody like you and people engaged in better governance, because the possibility of being able to hide money is one of the main enablers and motivations for corruption, right? Because, I mean, one thing is to be able to take the money away through a dirty procurement process or by divesting funds or in other ways. And another thing is, okay, what do I do with this money? I cannot put it under the mattress. It has to go somewhere to buy property, to do all the things you can do with money, but they need a channel. And this channel is part of the international financial system, which is the possibility of creating these shell companies, anonymous companies, sorry, so where you can hide your money. So the beneficial ownership is extremely important, because it will be able to cut that cycle of hiding the money. Now, the good news is that FATF is very effective and has been working for some time, and there is agreement now on having a standard. And that is extremely important, because as long as we don't have a standard that is understood and adopted by all the members of FATF, it will not be a useful tool, right? It will be just a voluntary thing that some do, etc. You do it differently. But once there's a standard and everybody that is part of it has to adopt it, then we have a starting point for the work. So that's moving in a very positive direction. And the second thing that is missing goes a little bit back into our previous comment, no? Okay, there's a standard and there's an obligation to perform certain tasks to implement this standard, but now they have to be done in a right way, no? You need to be able to actually register who are the real owners of companies. This information should be available for whoever wants to look at it. It should not be secret, it should be transparent. So there's a series of things that need to happen, again, because it's not enough to agree on the rule, then you need to implement it, no? But that's why this type of international instruments and agreements are very important, because at the end, it pushes a lot of the players involved to actually adopt a measure, a standard, a rule, a law, and then it opens the game to put pressure in actually implementing it. And there's always a bit of competition, and there's a bit of playing with it in terms of as advocates of pushing those governments that are lagging behind and congratulating those that are making progress, no? So that's something that we're expecting as an important step once the standard is properly accepted and adopted.
I think that it's actually going to be an interesting governance and anti-corruption conversation going forward, because in fact, it's an issue that concerns many countries. And as you say, the devil's in the detail around how the standard is actually implemented, and there are a number of alternatives or sort of mechanisms by which beneficial ownership can be traced and registered, and those alternatives are all kind of being proposed by the new FATF standard. But without going into sort of very technical details on beneficial ownership and FATF, perhaps we'd leave our audience, I thought, perhaps with the last question around sort of other issues that you think are critical to look for and to watch for in 2022 and maybe even beyond. What are sort of like, let's say, top three top of mind issues for policymakers to consider in their fight against corruption in the current context?
Yeah, thank you very much for allowing that closing question. And sorry to repeat again the beneficial ownership, but I think more than ever with what we're looking at, the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, actually goes back to this point, no? Because there's the discussion about sanctions opens this question. I mean, who is the West going to sanction? The oligarchs? Yeah, okay, which oligarchs? Where is their money? Do they actually know where to apply the sanctions? Where is the money? Maybe in some cases, but in most cases, this money has been channeled through shell companies, and nobody knows who are the owners, and so on and so forth. So I think we have a very real life, almost, this is happening, developing these last days. So that's why it's so important. And I think that this unfortunate geopolitical issue, military escalation, of course, puts the finger in there. I mean, we need to definitely cut that channel of being able to hide the money. That's one key thing. I think the other very important thing, again, I'll go back to civil society. I mean, increasingly, we see a clash of ideologies. No, we have the ideology promoted by democracy, by openness, like participation of citizens, elections, and so on, that allows for citizens to be actually the watchdogs of what their governments are doing, and it's a freedom of information, freedom of expression, and so on, against a model where the state doesn't want to have another actor looking into them. Doesn't mean that there's not a fight against corruption. I mean, I have to admit here, and some people might challenge that, there are some countries, let's say China, they actually have certain measures to counter corruption. I mean, one can argue that they are selective, they are not so effective or whatever, but they have certain anti-corruption system. One has to respect that, but it's one that does not allow the opinion, does not allow criticism, and does not allow the watchdog function of journalists, of civil society, and so on. So I think that opening the space for civil society to participate and allowing civil society to operate is one of the big challenges we have in the near future, no, for the next year, and it's very real, no. I think those are two key elements, and the last one, and this of course is nothing new, but has to do with political integrity. No, we have to stop this cycle where politics is mostly seen as a way of opening doors to benefit me, my sector, my group, my people. No, if you go into politics, you are there for a country, you're there for a state, you're there for people that go beyond your interest group or your own private interests. So I will leave it at that then, Alisa.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, for your comments, and for, I think today we've done an overview together of a number of important issues on the political economy side, and which is indeed what you concluded with, but also on technical issues on beneficial ownership and other sort of more specific issues that policymakers need to be cognizant of and look for and tackle in the coming years, following the pandemic and some of the lessons we learned, and particular sectors like healthcare that were highlighted as a result, but also in let's say, traditional sectors that are prone to corruption. So what we'll do is, for the interest of our audience, is put the link to the CPI report in this video or below the video, and we welcome you to have a look at this very interesting report that allows us to sort of analyze, pretty much the only tool that allows us to analyze trends in how countries perform in their anti-corruption performance. So I'd like to, with that, thank you, Alejandro, for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation with you.
Thanks to you for the invitation. Anytime. Thanks.
Thank you. And for our audience, thank you for joining us. We'll be back with future episode of Governance Dialogues that will continue this tradition of sort of discussions with thought leaders on governance priorities going forward. Thank you.